On the other hand, the second most significant category of harms, of the categories of themes, is that one associated with harms. Now, in a sense, that probably represents me saying to people, well, what are the harms of cannabis? So, and this is an example of going back to that previous slide where I was talking about how when you start asking questions, you're going to determine the answers. You know, people wanted to talk about what I would always start the questions, the interview with, so what does it mean to you to be a cannabis user? And people would start to say, oh, this, and this, and this. And I'd hear them out, and then I'd make a few notes, and I'd come back to points that they'd mentioned, and then we'd pick up on those. But I did find that, that sometimes I had to sort of prompt people a little bit to find out what they felt the harms were. And one of the reasons for doing that was because, of course, the preponderance of information and data that we have about drug use, in this case cannabis use, is medical, and it focuses on pathology. If one is going to develop a study or do a study of this sort of thing, of this nature, you do at least have to engage with that dominant discourse. You have to explore that, and that's expected, so that's something you have to do. But to some extent, I suspect this idea of harms and its prominence in the analysis was a consequence of my questioning. And that's an example of that sort of delicate line you have to walk when you're doing this kind of research, that you don't promote your own agenda all the way through it, and thereby skew it so far that you don't manage to try and get a more rounded analysis. So there are a range of phenomena there. I think it's interesting also to look at the harms over here. These double-headed arrows here are dynamic, represent dynamic relationships, therefore the influence going each way. And so people would argue that there were harms generated by policy. And we have a range of issues here. And then we have illegality up here, which is also a very prominent theme in the analysis. And we have a range of phenomena associated with illegality. And the people in the study would argue that these in fact represent harms. So there's a range of harms here. But we also have the classic health harms down here. These kinds of things here. So people were aware of the harms associated with cannabis use, relating to lung function, issues around dependence, inappropriate use such as in driving, that sort of thing. At the same time, they felt that there were a range of harms that were also generated by policy. And as you can see, those are quite substantial. Now, whether or not paranoia, for example, is generated by policy, or whether it's also a function of the actual drug itself. The other thing I think it's important to consider also is that this part, in fact, right up probably to this point here, this sort of 2/3 to the left of the diagram, really relates to the experiences of users solely, of cannabis users. And so that is a type of knowledge that's generated by experience. That's experiential knowledge. Of course, having said that, we've already noted that experiential knowledge is something that's not allowed. You're not allowed to talk about your knowledge as a cannabis user. Because you gain that...
Except to other users.
Pardon?
Except to other users.
Well, precisely, except to other users. This is the thing. So you're allowed to have these conversations, and you can have them on the internet, and you can have them in various fora on the internet. But you can't have them in mainstream society. You will not see them in the ODT. You will not see them on the news. Okay? This type of knowledge here, which I would argue is a highly developed type of knowledge, relates specifically to the experience of cannabis users. Now, this type of knowledge does also, but this knowledge here is also aligned with policy and with those authorities who are charged with overseeing the laws around cannabis use. And typically, these people here will not, if they do use cannabis, will not, first of all, admit to it, and will not refer to that knowledge as their knowledge if they were to discuss it. So these themes here, on the one hand, they represent more uniform ideas that users had about their experience of cannabis use, but they also represent the knowledge of society at large, which is a more homogeneous knowledge but it is also a knowledge that is less informed by the actual experience of use. And yet it sees itself as the legitimate type of knowledge. Whereas the user's knowledge, all these things about growing, quality, strength, different types of pot, dosage, gifting, abstinence, physical space, purity.
What do those two mean, physical space and respect?
Okay, physical space, and feel free, all of you, to ask questions about these. Physical space was the fact that space, I argue that space was mediated use. For example, people would, you can only use cannabis in certain places. You can use it in your home, right? But you'll probably only use it in certain rooms. You might not use it in the front room when there's where there's no curtain or something like that, or through the day. So you might use it out the back. If there are children around, you won't use it near where the children are. So it mediates space in that sense. If you're having a party, there will be a place where cannabis users go to use cannabis if it's a general party. You know, the other guys are up the front drinking, as one of the participants said, they're all up the front in the lounge drinking beer and vomiting all over the carpet and making real asses out of themselves. But we're quietly sitting there smoking our cannabis, going, "Oh God, this is a nightmare." Or people will ask. People will ask, "Do you mind if I smoke cannabis?" No, I don't want you to do that. And so, oh, okay, well. And so the notion here of respect, people talked a lot about respect. Okay, they said, well, out of respect for people who don't use cannabis, I choose to use cannabis here. I don't use it in their face. This sort of thing. So there was this from the point of view of the cannabis user, there was quite a developed set of ideas around use, which related to things like ritual and etiquette and appropriateness and space and so on. This is an interesting narrative. This person was the only person who was primarily negatively aligned with the use of cannabis. He turned up at my office at the time, took part in the interview, and then the deal was you did an interview and then you did a questionnaire. It's a very detailed questionnaire. And then I phoned him up for the interview and said, "Oh no, I think you've got enough information, that's fine." And so unfortunately I didn't get the rest of he didn't quite sort of get it. But I thought, and if you look through his transcript, a lot of what he says is quite, he was the most negatively aligned in terms of his opinions about cannabis use. And that was very strongly mediated, I think, by this negative experience that he'd had, and he didn't use any more. He was also the only non-user in the sample, non-user currently at that time. Whether or not some of the other people in the sample have subsequently ceased their use, I don't know. It'd be great to track them down, but unfortunately I decided I wouldn't keep the details, so I occasionally run into people who were in the study. There's another one here. This is another comment from him. And as I say, he didn't use, at the time of interviewing, he didn't use any more, but he still felt that he had been sort of tarnished by his use.
How long had he actually been using for?
Prior to that?
Yeah.
A number of years, on and off, but he was quite interesting. He wouldn't use with anybody else. He'd buy it himself from people he didn't know, and he'd use it himself, and he wouldn't generally use with other. He wouldn't use with other people. He wouldn't have sessions with his mates or anything like that. He didn't actually seem to be part of a peer group who were generally cannabis users. He kind of kept it all hidden away, and I guess the classic tripartite assessment of the drug experience is drug, set and setting. So you've got the drug, you've got the set, which is the psychological state, and you've got the setting, the context, the environment in which you're using. And you'd have to wonder about the experiences that the person might have if they were obviously perhaps feeling kind of guilty about it, or not feeling that it was a good thing. And it may well also have been that he did have a certain mental fragility about him anyway, and as a consequence had that negative experience. Right.